Welcome to the June 5th edition of the Fire on the Fives, brought to you by the National Weather Service Fire Weather Program. Fire on the Fives is a webinar series that presents the latest science and best practices regarding the fire environment and fire weather. Please ensure that you mute your phone or use the audio pin provided. Do not put your phone on hold. Thank you. You must use the audio pin provided by GoToWebinar if you wish to be unmuted during the question and answer session to ask your question directly to the presenter. If you are unable to use the pin, you may post your questions in the question box in your GoTo control panel, and the moderator will ask the question for you. This talk will be recorded and posted to the National Weather Service Fire Weather YouTube, and you can do a search on YouTube for NWS Fire Fives, and you will be given the link to the Fire on the Fives webinar series. Today's presenter is Dr. Matt Jolly, research ecologist for the U.S. Forest Service. He works at the Missoula Fire Sciences Laboratory in the Rocky Mountain Research Station. Today, Matt will be talking about the National Fire Danger Rating System, or NFDRS, past, present, and future. Welcome, Matt.
Thank you so much. We'll get switched over here to my screen and we'll get started. So my name is Matt Jolly. I'm a research ecologist with the Missoula Fire Lab for the U.S. Forest Service at Rocky Mountain Research Station. And over the last 10 plus years, we've been working on science, improved science that can be leveraged to improve the National Fire Danger Rating System. And about 4 years ago, we requested permission from the National Wildfire Coordinating Group to actually implement some improved science or changes to the national system. So what I want to talk about today is just very briefly some of the changes that we made to that system, and then also where those changes are taking us in the future. Some of this is related to the National Weather Service in particular, but some of it more broadly to the entire NFDRS user community. One of the reasons that we know that weather is important is because weather is a major driver of burned area across the United States. So just by using some fairly simple metrics of fire weather season length, we're able to account for upwards to 70 to 85% of the burned area across western forests. So our ability to track changes in weather, to quantify them, and then to distribute them or deliver them to managers for decision-making metrics is absolutely paramount to our ability to manage wildland fire in a dynamic system, where each year we set new records or we have events that have not been witnessed before, at least in this generation, if not in this lifetime. And that is essentially what the National Fire Danger Rating System does for us. It gives us the ability to integrate weather into metrics that we know are meaningful, that help us understand and predict the kinds of fires that are likely to happen, where fires are likely to happen, but more importantly, to leverage that information to make the best decisions we can. In the early development of the National Fire Danger Rating System, they expressed 4 guidelines for what a fire danger rating system should be, and we've tried to use these as a sort of a guiding principles or basically an underpinning framework for how we move forward. So because early on when the systems were created, they were regionally adopted and regionally modified so that the concept of a national system was not realized until they recognized the need to bring all those regional systems back under a national framework. And that happened in the late 60s and early 70s. But the important thing is that the fire danger rating system that we use right now was developed in 1972, modified in 1978, and for all intents and purposes hasn't been modified, changed, or improved for 40 years. So a lot of science has changed since then, but the guiding principles still remain the same, and that is that we know that this system needs to be scientifically based, and not just scientifically based, but that leverages the best available science, the best available models, and the way to apply those models, and the analytical methods that we use to derive metrics from them. All those things need to be founded in a consistent scientific framework. They also know that fire is different all over the country, and that that these things need to be adaptable, or at least applied locally, so that local managers can use the same thing that national managers see. We know that it needs to be applicable anywhere in the country, and this is probably the single hardest thing to do, because we have to create a national system that's generic. And by generic, it means that we ought to be able to plop it down anywhere, pull the appropriate weather data to run it, and generate the indices that we need to calculate fire danger anywhere. It sounds simple, but it's not all that simple. Essentially, the final guiding principle is reasonably inexpensive to operate. So we know that we maintain a network of remote automated weather stations around the country. We leverage that with the great information that we get from the National Weather Service to produce forecasts of fire danger, but generally, in terms of the overall impact to the user, it's pretty minimal. The simplest structure for how these things work is that the National Fire Danger Rating System is essentially a weather-based system that calculates a series of fire danger indices. It does that by first calculating live and dead fuel moistures, and using those live and dead fuel moistures in a fire spread model to calculate metrics that are equivalent to rates of spread and fire intensity, but we don't really apply them that way. We combine them with some descriptions of the fuels, but the fuels probably are not nearly as important as the weather that goes into them. And certainly what we know is that the most valuable piece of all of this is the ability to generate a forecast so that people can stay ahead and plan for the next day. So we take the weather data, use it to calculate live and dead fuel moistures and a drought index. That calculates, once we combine with the site parameters, fire danger indices. So the common ones are burning index, ignition component, spread component, energy release component, and all those are used through a planning process to make preparedness and response decisions for wildland fire. Just one example of the fire danger rating system is how do we communicate conditions to the public and then other user agencies. So particularly things like the adjective fire danger rating maps, the low, moderate, high, very high, and extreme that we produce nationally are generated first from observed data, but then our forecast for the next day using the next day forecast produced by the National Weather Service. The one challenge right now is that, and it's the one thing we think we're finally overcoming, is that the NDFD we know produces a 7-day forecast, but the FWM forecast that we use for fire weather has only historically been a next day forecast. So we're in the transition of getting that forecast moved from a 24-hour forecast to a 7-day forecast, so that we can start providing longer lead time outlooks to fire managers. So we have the formatters and everything. They've been tested, and I think we finally have approval for folks to start picking up and doing this. And then we've tested all of our downstream applications to make sure that it can successfully produce the fire danger forecast that we need from those 7 days. So that's a nice new capability that we'll be adding in the future, thanks in large part to the cooperation from the National Weather Service. So, as I said before, the National Fire Danger Rating System essentially sat static for 40 years. There was a very minor modification in 1988 that updated a few small pieces of the live fuel moisture model and some of the fuel model parameters, but didn't really change very much. And for all intents and purposes, the system we use now in 2018 was developed and implemented in 1978. A lot's changed since then, and we've learned a lot. So, but our changes here are meant to really to position us for the future, which is what we'll talk about at the end of this talk today. But essentially, we have replaced the live fuel moisture model in NFDRS, replaced the dead fuel moisture models. There's two of them that we're replacing with a single physically based model, and then consolidating the existing fuel models into 5 fuel types. Ultimately, the goal here is to streamline and simplify as much as possible. We learned that a lot of the stuff that was in there had no value in predicting differences in fire potential across landscapes. So we're able to really get rid of some things that were just adding complexity for no gain. We want to make it easier so that we can start teaching it to firefighters much earlier than we do now. And also, we want to position ourselves to be able to leverage pure gridded data in the future. So our system now requires humans to log in every day and to change codes in the database to make sure that weather data gets archived, to put in state of the weather, and that's the only way that that an actual index is produced for that day. And in a lot of cases, it's the only way that a forecast is produced the next day. So it's really challenging because if somebody gets busy and they can't log in time to change those codes, then the indices don't get calculated, they don't get published, there's no forecast for the next day, and the whole system just breaks down just because of this human input requirement. So all these changes position us to get rid of all those human requirements and create a system that's fully automated. The live fuel moisture model we are replacing with a phenology model called the growing season index. The growing season index is a fully automated weather-based phenology model that can actually predict green up and curing and pretty much all of the live fuel dynamics that we care about for fire danger is integrated into this very simple model. The model also integrates conditions like freezing, transition to dormancy, but the big thing is that traditionally, not only did people have to log in every day to set R's to O's and put in the state of the weather, they also had to manage the live fuel conditions. So they had to log in at least seasonally and define when green up happened. They would have to go in and force either curing or dormancy for some of the live fuels. And in the 88 system, they would have to do that either every day or at least once a week to make it work. So this model gets rid of all of that manual tuning, provides a generalized way of representing live fuel conditions across the whole country, and it is generalized across biomes. So if you move the model from the Southwest United States to the Northeast, it just figures out what the dominant controls are and automatically transitions. So the GSI is just based off of 3 very simple weather, either weather variables or derived variables. So 24-hour daily, so 24-hour minimum temperature, photo period, and 24-hour maximum vapor pressure deficit. And the combination of those 3 things looked at over time, basically over a running average, can tell us a lot about the live fuel dynamics that we observe on the landscape. So the model itself automatically can predict green up date and time, the green up date, and transition to greener, wetter fuels that don't burn as well. And then also there's a lot of interannual variability, so it can show that green up generally can happen as early as, or with some variability of in some cases 4 to 6 weeks. So that it doesn't predict the same green up date every year. It predicts it based on changes in the springtime weather conditions or whatever weather conditions are driving that. So as I said, the model is very simple. It's derived, calculated from weather observations and nothing else, and it works very well for what we need for fire danger. The next change that we made is the dead fuel moisture model. So historically we had 2 models. We had a model for the fine dead fuels, so basically things like leaves and pine needles and very small sticks, and 100 and 1,000-hour fuels used a separate or different kind of model for things that were essentially larger sticks greater than an inch in diameter or greater than 3 inches in diameter. And we're able to condense all that down to a single model. And then Nelson model is a fully physically based fuel moisture model that runs on hourly weather data. So that is a change from what we've done in the past, but it gives us a lot that we didn't have before. So it just uses temperature, relative humidity, solar radiation, and precipitation as direct inputs. So just hourly, those hourly 4 sensible weather parameters we use to drive this model. And the model itself is scalable, so we can actually define the size stick that we want to model, and we can replicate that 4 times to generate the 4 time lag fuel moisture classes that we need for NFDRS. So we can make a really small stick all the way up to basically a 3-inch diameter stick. And it has a few really nice characteristics. One is that the model uses a full energy balance to calculate the fuel temperature and the near surface moisture condition, and that eliminates the need to put in the daily state of the weather that was used in the old model. Also, it is a fully physically based model, so it models basically the water vapor diffusion and the capillary transport inside the sticks. And it gives us some things that we've never had access to before, like how dew formation affects the surface fuel moistures, and also how we can basically modify the environment when the snow covers up the fuels. So the model is pretty amazing, actually, at its agreement with diurnal fuel moisture changes, and then week to week and month to month variations as well. So you get really good agreement with diurnal and the seasonal agreement, basically between observed and predicted. So in this case, the red lines are the measured fuel moistures and the dashed lines are the modeled fuel moistures. And you can see a really good close coupling between the 24-hour variations and then the capturing of the rain events. And the same applies once we start looking at larger diameter fuels as well. So they spent almost 10 years basically developing this model and then evaluating it against different size classes of fuels in different parts of the country, and saw good agreement everywhere. The last major change is that NFDRS developers in the beginning really wanted a national fire danger rating system that was simple. So they originally proposed reducing the 9 fuel models from the 72 system down to 4 in the 78 update. But in the 78 update, they had a steering committee, and that steering committee said that there's no way you can represent all the fuels in the country with 4 fuel models. And they said, well, how many do you want? He said, well, how about 20? So they said, okay, well, we'll make 20. And in the 88 system, they changed some of those fuel models too. So they essentially added 20 more fuel models to NFDRS. One of the things we've learned is that you don't actually even need the fuel model for NFDRS to be useful. So a way that we apply it nationally is to fix the fuel model everywhere, regardless of the fuel that's actually there, and use the system just to depict the seasonality of weather conditions at any given place. So adding more fuel models doesn't actually add a lot of value to the system. So, and we also found that the fuel models themselves weren't unique. So when we ran ERC calculations across the country for a dozen weather stations that were equally spread out across the whole country for multiple years, we found that when we did the correlation matrix, we basically found that there were some fuel model groups that were nearly identical. So if you, in the case of fuel model I, J, and K, which is our old slash fuel models, the correlations between the ERCs for those were 1.0, meaning that they were perfectly correlated. They had a different magnitude, so an ERC of 95 might be the maximum for one, an ERC of 120 might be the max for another, but the seasonality was exactly the same. And in fire danger, we apply everything in a relative sense. So for every point on the landscape, we express that point, the value calculated at that point, in terms of the percentile range for that area. So we may say today's ERC is 62, and that represents the 97th percentile. That's how we communicate it, because an ERC of 62 doesn't mean the same thing else. It means all over the country for that one place. So we have to translate those numbers into something more meaningful. So we do that through percentiles anyway, which means that there's no reason for us to make model decisions based on the absolute value of an index. So what we found is that we can consolidate all the fuel models down to 5 fuel type groups. So grass, shrub, brush, timber, and slash. And by doing that, we represent the unique characteristics of all the fuel models from the old system, and we realign those fuel models with the fire behavior prediction system fuel models that we already have. So we use a GR2, a GS2, shrub, timber litter 1, and our 5 fuel type groups. And that means that we don't have to teach a different set of fuel models for fire danger to firefighters than we do for the fire behavior prediction systems that we use, like Behave Plus and Farsight, FlamMap, WIFTUS, all the things that are embedded in there. So there's a lot of value in simplifying the fuel models as well. So what we get out of all this is that the manual live fuel moisture, dead fuel moisture entries are gone. Basically, there are no manual inputs to this new system at all. We have all the revisions. The 88 system are gone. The old load transfer, the dead and live fuel moisture models are gone, and we get rid of 35 fuel models, and we align the fuel models that we keep with an existing set of fire behavior fuel models, so that we don't have to teach a different set of fuel models to firefighters. And ultimately, though, all these simplifications put us in a place to run all of this on a grid. So this is just a diagram of what the new system looks like. Basically, we have for the dead fuel moistures, we use hourly weather observations of relative humidity, temperature, solar radiation, and rainfall. The live fuel moistures, they don't change that fast, so we have daily summaries for vapor pressure deficit, minimum temperature, and then we calculate photo period or day length. We combine those together with the fuel model weighting and a drought index to produce our indices, and then those indices are leveraged in planning applications to support decision making for wildland fire across the entire country. So we essentially end up with a fully automated, more consistent system. We have a better response to drought, but we have hooks for future improvements that can better leverage drought indices in the future. But we're more easily applied or more easily adapted to using gridded weather in the future. So one of the things that I'm really interested in is why all this matters. And if you go back and look at reports that summarize firefighter fatalities, major findings of those reports are usually a lack of situational awareness of the fire weather conditions. So how do we communicate fire weather conditions in a way that can be used to improve the situational awareness of firefighters, and that can also be leveraged to change what we do and how we do it under these isolated conditions. So one of the things that we've developed is a start at leveraging gridded weather data to start providing some metrics that can do that. So we use the National Digital Forecast database from National Weather Service, and we combine it with observed 100-hour and 1,000-hour fuel moistures from our raw WIMS network to basically produce a daily forecast of the energy release component and burning index. So the energy release component tells us how hot and dry it is. The burning index tells us how windy it is. The challenge with this has always been that it's easy to produce this map of ERC values, but but interpreting them is really challenging because we need the historical context for each point on the landscape to normalize it. So we have a gridded climatology now that runs through from 1979 to 2015. So basically across the entire continental United States, for every pixel, we know the historical range of ERC values and BI values for that pixel, which means we can combine it with our NDFD forecast of fire danger, normalize that forecast to percentiles, and produce a percentile map of fire danger conditions. And we can also combine our classified percentile maps for ERC and BI into a single metric. So essentially that single metric we call severe fire weather potential tells us how hot, dry, and windy it is relative to how hot, dry, and windy it normally is for that particular pixel for that day. It's valuable because the more we study these things, the more we find that these two metrics tell us a lot about fire behavior. So these dark red areas that are on these graphs are places where people observed what they determined was extreme or erratic fire behavior. And the blues, or not blues, but the dark greens were places where fires were smoldering, and then gradations of the fire behavior in between. These three panels on the left are for 3 different national forests in western Montana, all with a little bit different response, but overall quite similar in terms of where the extreme fire behavior happened. So by combining the ERC and the BI, we have metrics that help us better understand these relationships. So you can think of the 2 layers that I just previously showed you, the ERC and the BI, as being basically our hot and dry index on one axis and the windy index on the other. And in the upper right is where all of the extreme fire behavior actually happens. So we're producing these every day on a map interface called through the Wildland Fire Assessment System. And it's mobile enabled, so you can pull up the maps and you can look at them and see what they look like. And it incorporates a few other things, so geomac fire locations, perimeters, modus and veers, active fire detects from the GTAC active fire mapping program. And here's just a few examples. So this red box here is on the map on the left panel is highlighting an area around the observation fire, which at this point was already contained. And then shortly after the observation fire was contained, a new fire start was reported. And that fire was the Roaring Lion fire. The Roaring Lion fire blew out of Roaring Lion Creek towards the city of Hamilton, and then particularly towards populated areas along the front of the Bitterroot Range. And it happened really fast. But this forecast, using the National Digital Forecast database, turning it into a BI forecast, showed that the conditions for that day were well above the 99th percentile of BI. And we produced the forecast before the fire was ever even reported. But a little closer to more recently, the same thing was applied in the southeast during the fall season of 2016, where basically it just stopped raining. It stopped raining during the fall when a typical fall fire season would have happened anyway, increasing the severity of and the fuel dryness, but leading to fires like the one in Gatlinburg, Tennessee, that burned into the city of Gatlinburg, Tennessee, and areas of Pigeon Forge, killing 14 people, burning up more than 2,200 structures, all in a less than 48-hour period. Another example of the product just for the Santa Rosa fires. So these were forecasts that were produced ahead of time, that can be made available ahead of time. There were a lot of fatalities in those events, but it was also one of those things where they could have used something like this better, but it really was something that they're still not aware of very much. So really trying to do the outreach to get the right things into people's hands. A little bit harder one for me to take is this Thomas fire. So the Thomas fire was burned Southern California, December 2017. I recognized that things were getting pretty bad down there. So the ERCs in some places were above the 100th percentile, so they'd never been as dry as they were, at least from our 30-plus year climatology. And so screen captured it, sent it to my CAL FIRE fire behavior analyst friend. Said, you know, you guys probably want to know this and just keep it in mind. And before the end of the day, he sent me a text back that said a firefighter had died in a burnover. So these are literally life-saving metrics that, when applied appropriately, can change what we do. So why does it all matter? Well, we've already talked about these accident investigations, but if we go one step farther and we summarize them, there's a few things that we see. One is that just looking at a few fires, we can see that the solid bars here are basically the sum of the people assigned to those fires every day over the duration of the incident. And then the hatched lines are the area growth of those fires. So we're in a situation where we have the most people assigned to incidents that are growing aggressively under those conditions, increasing exposure to responders, and then also decreasing the probability of success of any kind of action. But we can quantify these things. Even harder to accept, though, is if we look at entrapments. So this is a map of firefighter entrapments across the entire country, the entire continental United States, not the entire country, from 1979 to 2016. There's 112 of them. And if we sample these points for the ERC and BI percentile for the day of those entrapments, things that we can now forecast thanks to the National Digital Forecast Database, we get something that looks like this. So basically, this upper right-hand corner of this is the number of entrapments or fatalities that occurred when the ERC and the BIs were at the highest percentile. You'll notice that this graph looks an awful lot like the fire behavior graph that I showed you before. But out of that 112, 85 of them happened when either the ERC or the BI was above the 90th percentile. So this is not just a decision support metric that says how many people do I have on staff today, how do I set Smokey Bear's arm. Fire danger itself, particularly when leveraged with gridded weather data, can provide life or death information to firefighters if we can determine the best way to put it in their hands. So one of the ways we're trying to do that is to start thinking more holistically about how we deliver situational awareness tools, how we incorporate this into a series of preseason agreements or action plans for both initial attack and extended responses to fires. How do we bring a lot of this these other data in so that we start recognizing that fire danger can inform both preparedness decisions and response / situational awareness based decisions. And so with that, I will end the talk, and I'll take any questions that are out there.
Great. Thank you, Matt. That was outstanding. Appreciate it. We'll have our question and answer session now. I don't see any questions submitted via the question box on the control panel, but if anybody has a question that they want to ask, either type it in that question box or you can raise your hand on the control panel and I will try and unmute you. Let's see, it looks like Chris Gibson's got his hand raised. So Chris, can you hear us?
Yes, I can hear you.
Okay, go ahead with your questions, Chris.
Thanks a lot, Matt. That was great. I saw that a couple weeks ago too here at the university. Given that the Weather Service is often providing some of the last information that firefighters on the ground will get in the form of a spot forecast read over the radio, interpreted for the local conditions by the division soups and so forth, what's the possibility of tying some of this information directly to the spot forecast, directly into our formatted product that we disseminate?
So one of the things that we're trying to work out now is are the mechanics for delivering these data back to you. We've tried a couple of ways, but I think we have a workable solution with a NetCDF file that can be basically re-ingested back into the GFE, so that you would have access to this information in addition to the weather information that you're providing as part of a spot forecast, and we could close that loop. Ultimately, not very long from now, we'll be generating these, particularly the first 72 hours hourly. So you'll be able to not only know the places for the day that were bad, but also the times of the day that are likely to be worse. But I think that all of those things can be provided back and reintegrated so that we start with a common messaging. And I think the same information can help improve the red flag warnings and so watches and warnings in general. So because they're definitely a lot more spatial.
Thanks, Matt. That's a great point on the red flag warnings. Thank you, Matt.
Matt, I have a question for you. What kind of feedback have you gotten on the NFDRS from folks that are using the Canadian fire danger rating system, folks up in Alaska, and I believe there's portions of Minnesota, Michigan, Wisconsin, and the Northeast?
Well, we're kind of taking the long game with that, quite honestly, because we know, well, what we have to do is run these things side by side and look at the similarities and differences and really better understand what they're telling us. Because, you know, when I was running our new NFDRS for Fairbanks, it was better than the Canadian indices. But the fact is that the Canadian indices are so ingrained in the operational framework there. We have to come up with a solution, but I suspect that'll be the next thing that we tackle after we get this rollout done for the NFDRS 2016. Is that what do we do there? Do we just, because I'm at this point contemplating just wrapping it all up into a North American fire danger rating system and just have it all available, so that the Canadian indices, the U.S. indices are just available in the same framework. Because honestly, I don't care as long as we're using the same information, and everybody is learning the same thing. The real challenge is that we teach the U.S. National Fire Danger Rating System to firefighters. We don't teach the Canadian system. So when a firefighter goes to Canada, or they go to Wisconsin, or they go to Minnesota, and they start hearing these other things, they've never been exposed to that before. A reason for having a national system is so we can have a national language. And right now we have two languages. Might as well be like French Canadian and English. But yeah.
Okay.
I guess the short answer is that that's probably our very next thing to start understanding and figure out a pathway forward. But I think part of that has to be science-based, because I haven't had anybody convince me that one is better than the other yet, even in Alaska, or certainly the new system, even in Alaska or the Lake States.
Right.
So that's the challenge.
Anybody have any other questions for Matt?
Let me off easy.
I see that Heath has typed in hello. I don't know if that is if he's got a question there, or Heath, I'm unable to, looks like you didn't put in your audio pin, so I'm unable to unmute you, but if you want to type in your question. Okay, he says he does have a question. Go ahead and type it in the question box. And I'm seeing your Seeing stuff come up on the question box, but I'm assuming you're writing your question right now. So there we go. So Heath asks, could you let us know the time frame we might expect a more of a gridded NFDRS system instead of the point forecast system?
So that's a good question. So once we have this new model stable, we get people using it. I think right now our gridded system is based off of the old 78 system with some simplifying assumptions, but it works pretty well. And transitioning the new model over is actually going to be pretty straightforward. So most likely start working on that in the next year, and possibly over the next 1 or 2 years. It's easier said than done though, because everything that we do in fire management is still anchored to fire danger coming from a RAWS station. So we not only have to change the science and technology part, we have to actually reinvent the application part. So we'll have to be doing all those in parallel to help move us forward. Because ultimately what I'd like to see us get to is, rather than having the National Weather Service issue point forecast, is that they go into the database and you guys correct for the RAWS locations in the NDFD and make sure that that gets submitted, and that we just grab the NDFD to use it for the fire for our fire weather application. Because I've learned this because of our request to go from 24-hour to 7-day forecast. It's taken a really long time to get that to get it through things like unions and all that, because it's a workload impact for you folks, and so it's a challenge. But I think that if we just start using the grid, particularly tailored towards fire weather, then we still have that cooperative relationship. It simplifies the way that things get delivered, and it makes it easier for us to leverage. If you change the resolution, or you change the outlook time frame about, you go from 7 days to 10 days, or you change from 3 hourly to hourly for certain time periods, then we don't have to make big changes to the system every time that happens. So we're moving in that direction. Our FAM IT folks are on board with some of these changes, and hopefully we'll start seeing some changes soon, but it's going to take a village, and it's going to take a long time.
So Chris Gibson asked if all the WFOs are running the 7-day formatter, and I don't believe that's the case. I think that there are a handful of offices that are running the 7-day formatter as a test, and we're talking about whether we should expand that to all offices. So I'll put the question to you, Matt, is that while we're looking at a future where NDFD will be incorporated into the NFDRS, is there a gain to be had here in the short term with expanding our current point forecast from a 1-day to a 7-day?
There absolutely is, and I say that because, just to reiterate what I said before, which is all fire danger is done is anchored to RAWS stations. So a logical step is to say, okay, now we're going to go from a next day forecast to a 7-day forecast for this point. It'll be available to you in WIMS. You can start thinking about how you would leverage this new information to start planning an entire week instead of tomorrow. And then the next logical step is say, okay, we can turn this now to a spatial representation. It's a very logical, easy bite-sized chunks to make, and I think there's absolutely value in moving forward with just doing the 7-day forecasts now, especially given that the data are already there, and that it shouldn't be a huge change in operations to get that to make that happen. And we're still going to leverage the daily forecast that you're producing anyway for this. So I absolutely believe that there's value in taking that step because it helps move us along and helps move us out of the paradigm that we're in now, and it'll make the transition to the gridded data easier.
Heath Hockenberry just informed me that the Mission Delivery Council, which consists of the regional directors and other heads of the Weather Service, have bought off and approved the expansion of 7-day NFDRS forecast for the point forecast. So I think that's good news and ties in, Matt, with what you said, and as information to those on this call or those that might be listening to the recording, that if your office does not do 7-day NFDRS forecast right now, that that capability is there, and that if you want to incorporate that with your partners, I think the consensus is that's a good thing.
Yeah, I know that it was basically approved. Yeah, sorry, go ahead.
No, go ahead. See, John Bonk says we're very good at forecasting trends and pretty good at short-term hard numbers. Would there be a benefit to using the current trends for the 7 days from NDFD, but not necessarily the exact hard numbers?
Yeah, I think so. There's a few things that we're working on in that regard, but I think that even doing trends of the thing that we're generating, so like are the ERCs going up or the ERCs going down on average? I think there's probably some derived products out there that we could start creating that would make that easier. And the same with the 7-day just out of WIMS. We're really working towards a dashboard approach to make some of these things more visual. And I think, showing those trends is really what people want to see. I agree that using that stuff is probably going to be, well, it'll be valuable. And the nice thing about fire danger is sometimes they're, having small errors in the forecast don't propagate into big errors in the calculated fire danger indices, because so many weather parameters go in to calculate those ERCs. So it kind of buffers out some of that being wrong a little bit with the absolutes, and still capturing the trends. So I think there's still there's some derived products that we ought to focus on, particularly in that trend domain, to start communicating better too. So.
Okay. John Bonk, who asked that question, I have unmuted you. Did you have any follow-up questions or comments?
Well, just mostly that I think it would be a good way to implement NDFD much more quickly, and maybe not stress out folks that are worried about the workload impacts. So more or less just if we can still focus on the next day or two for the hard numbers perhaps, and then just let the trends shake out in the NDFD. I really think that'd be a good compromise to maybe just speed up the whole implementation process rather than having folks be super concerned on the full 7-day hard numbers.
Oh, I see. Yeah, I see.
Okay, we're going to go to Jeff Colton. Jeff, you are unmuted. Did you want to ask a question?
Yeah, I just had a quick question. One of our biggest complaints from our forecasters every year is getting fuels updated from the GAC level, from fuel specialists out in the field. Will this be able to help replace some of that, maybe make that process smoother? Do you envision that? As far as issuing red flag warnings and flashes.
I think eventually it can replace it. So that, because from our new system, we'll be able to provide both the current and the departure of live and dead fuel moistures, and show the areas where, the fuels are really drying out, maybe where grassland, where herbaceous fuels are cured or are curing, and things like that can go back in to inform watches and mornings. So I still think there's a lot that but there's still you can't replace having that engagement with the field, but when you can't get information from them because they're too busy or there's nobody to do it, then this will provide what you need.
Okay. Thanks.
Thank you, Jeff. Heath informs us that they're looking to expand the number of offices issuing the 7-day weather string through an official experimental forecast period, and they'll be asking volunteer offices to implement the tool through the regions. So just some information for you on that. Are there any other questions, comments? Okay. Well, Matt, thank you very much for your time, and thanks for all the, oh, wait a minute. We have one more question from Heidi Strader. Let me see if I can unmute her. Where is she? Heidi, you are unmuted. Go ahead with your question.
Yes, thank you. So yeah, this is Heidi Strader. I'm up in Fairbanks, Alaska in the GAC here. And Matt, you were talking about the NFDRS, and we, or the CFFDRS compared to the NFDRS, and we have looked at using the NFDRS a number of times, but we still find that the Canadian indices are still outperform, especially later in the season. And Zeke Zeal has kind of run some numbers looking back into 2004 using the new ERC. And that was kind of a remarkable year for us because we had such a dry late summer, early fall, which was really remarkable. And the Canadian indices captured it quite well, showing peaks similar to what we'd seen earlier that season, whereas looking at the new ERC-Y data, it showed there was another peak, but it was much, much lower and wouldn't have indicated to the user that it was going to be such an intense, crazy time of year. So we're certainly interested in working with you and trying to understand the differences between the systems and make it so that others know the differences too. And we'd love to have you come up here if there's a chance during the summertime to come up and see everything in action, I guess. So just my 2 cents.
Yeah, no, like I said, the best way to do a lot of this is just through case studies. The one thing to know about the stuff he did is that it's very likely not going to be the same now, because we've fixed some things that we found were just blatantly wrong with systems that were delivered before. So if it hasn't been done literally in the last month, it's probably out of date.
Okay.
So just an FYI, but I'm not saying
Great.
Either way.
Yeah, no, it's good to hear that you guys are still pushing forward on, making it great. So cool.
So, and like I said too, if it comes down to that, something like one of the Canadian codes is superior, then we just incorporate it. There's no problem. But what we need to do is incorporate it into everything, and we need to incorporate it into how we teach fire danger. And if we do that, then we're good.
Yeah, and we've actually kind of built an introductory class for folks who do come up and are unfamiliar with it. And one of our main tools is the Alaska Fire and Fuels website, where we have started using the gridded model data to help to fill in the holes around Alaska, since we have a lot of them in between our station data. And the other thing that allows us is, whereas WIMS really limits us as to which stations we can pull data in from, this website's letting us pull data from different sources like Park Service Research RAWs, the Cold Region Test Center that the Army runs, even US Array data we're able to run numbers on. And of course, it means having to QC the data a little more closely on a daily basis, but it's sure nice to have some more info out there too. So anyway, we're trying to push forward as well, but would really love to work with you on it.
Yeah, no, as soon as we get past this hurdle of getting things rolled out to get started, my next thing for the NDFD is to replicate our process for Alaska, so that we can producing the same CONUS products for Alaska. So we can, it'll at least be some things we can look at and start sharing and building off of.
Right. Cool, thank you.
Great. Thanks, Heidi. Any other questions or comments? Okay, with that, again, I would like to thank Matt for his time presenting on NFDRS today. This was fantastic and much appreciated. This concludes today's episode of Fire on the Fives. You can catch this episode or any of the Fire on the Fives episodes on YouTube by searching for NWS Fire Fives. This webinar is a presentation of the Fire Weather Program of the National Weather Service.